All here, and welcome to IonE's second Monday event. My name is Melissa Kenny, and I'm the new Associate Director for Knowledge Initiatives here at IonE. Yay! It's a little bit of a temperature shock. I'm coming from the Washington, D.C. area, and so it's going to take me a bit of time to transition to these Minnesota winters, but as I was telling other people, you all know how to do winter right, so I'm really looking forward to learning how to do a proper winter. Well, here at IonE, part of what our goal is to figure out ways to help people and the planet prosper together. And to solve these kinds of sustainability challenges, we need to work together as university experts, as leaders from communities, and as leaders from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And that's the goal of these forums. These forums are a gathering place for us to collaboratively explore new ideas. Thank you for being here. A place for us to develop new connections, and a place to start conversations about how to solve these big problems. And that's why we need you. We're so glad to have your expertise, and I'm so happy you came. And I hope you'll stick around for a little bit to develop a new connection or two while you're here. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Eric Lonsdorf. He is the lead scientist with the Natural Capital Project and the new lead for IonE's impact goal focus on sustainable land use in Minnesota. Thanks.
All right, thanks again for all being here. Before we start introducing the panel and talking, I wanted you, if you can, to look at the picture on the wall right there. It's been there a long time because it's an example of a landscape. And one of the biggest challenges we have in sustainable land use is actually to define what it means to be sustainable. So when you look at that, it's also helpful because I'm introverted, it makes me nervous when you look at me. So if you could look at the wall up there, basically as you're looking at it, what do you envision? Is that the right landscape? Is there anything missing? If you're interested in landscapes providing energy, you might look at the missing solar panels that could be in those sunny fields. Maybe we should have more solar panels. All right, and if you wanted, maybe you think there should be more dairy farming. There aren't any cows up there. Is that good? Or maybe you see the impending encroachment of the city coming into those ag fields in the future. Is that good or bad? What do you envision for the future? And if it doesn't look exactly like that, it means that something's going to have to change, right? Something in that landscape. It means someone who owns land is going to have to do something different to be sustainable. So that brings challenges. How do we do that? How do we get them to do that in a fair way, an equitable way? So part of our impact goals are related to land use too. Clean water, clean energy, and things that people have really rallied behind lately are pollinators. That's a pretty clear goal that people have, right? We're charismatic. They do things for us like providing resources for food, things like that. And so one of the challenges in solving that crisis of pollinator declines and insect declines involves both policy, management of land, and research and uncertainties, solving uncertainties that prevent us from making good decisions. So the panel that we have here is sort of a mix of policy, management, engagement, and science, okay, to kind of solve that. How do we create a sustainable landscape that supports people and pollinators, okay? So we have with us Jean Wagenius, a state representative since 1986, I believe, currently District 63B. I've known Jean for a while. I worked with her son, went to Carleton, which is where I went. We were in grad school together, and actually their family farm in Douglas County is used for one of the research sites called the Echinacea Project that her son runs. And I spent some time planting echinacea plants there and acquiring a really bad case of chiggers that led me to be a desk analyst in the field since. So thank you, Jean, for that experience. And then we have Chris Smith, who is a Protected Species Program Coordinator for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So they're actively involved in managing species in addition to the roads, so that's Chris's role, so working landscapes. Allison Caraveau, here in my immediate right, is the science coordinator for the Monarch Joint Venture, which is a national partnership of federal and state agencies and NGOs working together to support and protect monarch migration, a nice charismatic pollinator. And then Dan Caraveau, they're related by raising children and stuff, is an assistant professor in entomology and works at the Bee Research Lab on several projects that he'll talk about. So to start, I'm going to ask each of them the same question. They'll respond sort of from each of their perspectives, from research, science, management, policy. Okay, we'll have a few questions that we've talked about already, and then we'll open it up the floor to questions from you guys. Okay? So first, I wonder if you could discuss how you've been working on issues of pollinator conservation and in the past, as well as what you're working on now. And I'll start with Eugene.
So, pollinators came to the legislature in, can you hear? Okay. Pollinators came to the legislature in 2000 in the form of a bill that was brought, I'm a Democrat, and I was chairing the Committee on Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Pollution Control Agency Finance. And we got a bill that was to have habitat for honeybees. And that just screamed to us that it was coming from the chemical industry, and we were, of course, right about that. So it was just for honeybees, and we quickly switched and said, well, let's talk about habitat for all pollinators. One of the things we did was have our staff figure out how much of Minnesota could be pollinated by honeybees, and staff figured it out at about 5 to 7% of Minnesota could be pollinated by honeybees. The rest were native pollinators. We knew that this was a diversionary tactic, so we wouldn't be talking about pesticides. We are not naive. So that's how we got started, and in that 2 years, we were able to put a lot of legislation on the table. And so you will find a lot of statutes having to do with protecting pollinators. However, we went into the minority, and without being there to have oversight, not many of these statutes took. One big one that took was to say, we're having trouble?
Your microphone is cutting out, so I'm going to have you switch to this one, okay?
Oh, okay. Oh, all right, thanks.
And really speak up into it.
Okay. One of the statutes that took was the one that said when we are doing any kind of restoration, it has to have forbs from the beginning in the spring all the way through the summer and fall. That was not the habit of DNR before then, and that took. And I think our agencies have been good about that. Another of the statutes that I hoped would take went to the Department of Agriculture to develop what we were calling then refuges or reserves, so that there would be safe place for pollinators. That statute is still on the books, but that has not happened. So those are the kinds of things that we did. I also sit on the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, where there is money. And we funded some good projects there. One was the bee survey and the butterfly survey. Those are two of them. And I put this up for you on the table. In the butterflies survey, it was extraordinarily discouraging. We're looking at 2 butterflies that we have lost. And when the scientists were looking at 11 others, they couldn't find 7. So we have done, there's a huge loss. I think Dan can probably tell you about the bee survey, because we don't have the same kind of information, but I bet he has it, and that would be good to share. I can tell you more about legislation later, but why don't we just, although there is one thing I want to mention. One of the smartest things that LCCMR did was fund Dr. Eric Runquist at the zoo, who was looking at restoring butterflies, but also looking at pesticide drift, extraordinarily important. And then there is another one where researchers here are looking at roadsides and the downsides of using roadsides. How much pesticide, how much heavy metal, and the salts. So we don't have that law of unintended consequences for our pollinator restoration. So those are some of the things that we have done, and then later on I'll tell you about what's going on now.
Thanks, Jean. Dan, let's go to you. She was already talking about the bee survey. What about some of the work you've been doing?
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation and thanks for coming, everyone. So I work on native bees, which are an incredibly diverse and interesting group of organisms. So there's about 20,000 known species on Earth. We have 400 to 500 or more species in Minnesota alone. So they're a really fascinating group, and they're really critical for a lot of the ecosystem services and functions that we depend, things like crop pollination, pollination of a lot of our native plants and whatnot. My work now in the native bee lab is, there's a lot of projects going on. I could go on and on about them, but the one probably to highlight most importantly for this is this project that we call MAP, which is the Minnesota for Agricultural Pollinators Project. So this is a project that's been funded through some funding from the legislature, some funding from the United States Department of Agriculture, where we're looking at how to most effectively place habitat for bees onto the landscape. And we're actually asking kind of three things. We're asking how big does habitat need to be? So we have habitat of different sizes. Where does it need to be? So the idea here is that if you place a habitat in really heavy ag, is that good or bad for bees, or that sort of thing? So we're looking at landscape context. And then we're looking at types of flora resources. So in terms of, we have kind of a mix that's more focused maybe to honeybees, and then another mix that's more focused to kind of native bees, and looking at how those effects are. And what's exciting about it too is we're looking at multiple different variables in this. So we're looking obviously at native bees, which is what we do. We're also looking at the effect of these plantings on honeybees. And then as well, we're looking at it in terms of how it might affect the natural enemies of crop pests. So those insects that are predators of the things that eat crops, so things like predators of aphids and whatnot. So we're trying to look at this habitat on a multifunctional kind of scale within these working landscapes. And then finally, this is in collaboration with Eric, who's part of this project, is really trying to put the economics on it. So where do we get the best return for our investment in terms of biodiversity, in terms of maybe things like honey production, in terms of other things. So we're trying to look at this on a multifaceted level. And we're also looking at insecticide drift on this project as well. And what's been really exciting about this is a project, we just have it going in this year. We just got, we're actually putting in the habitat ourselves. So there's been a lot of observational type studies like this, but we're the first that I know of doing it really big on an experimental scale where we can control and make all the treatments kind of orthogonal to one another. So I'm really super excited about that. And when I wrote the grants, I was, really hoping that maybe we could get 30 farmers that might want to participate in this, maybe, and I kind of sold that to the granting agencies, not sure what the interest would be. We've had over 150 farmers express interest to put in this habitat. So there's been a really big outpouring from, this is mostly farmers in western Minnesota, to really put some of this habitat in the ground. That's been really, really exciting. So that's a project that is really getting started this year, and I'm super excited by it. And it's really kind of focusing on these working landscapes. That is kind of the focus of this today, what we have going on.
Cool. Let's we'll shift from ag now to roadside. So one of the major, I think, research ideas for helping the monarch is to use roadside corridors to help with monarch migration. And obviously this will turn to both you and Allison. We'll start with you, Chris, to talk about some of the roadside work.
Sure. So like we said earlier, I work for the Minnesota Department of Transportation, MnDOT. Most of you know us as MnDOT. And while we are tasked with maintaining our transportation infrastructure to move goods and services, our road right-of-way, those roadsides, can serve various other purposes, pollinator habitat being one of them, although we have heard that there can be consequences, sometimes unintended consequences of using roadsides for habitat. And so we really try to take the research that researchers put out there, distill that down, and implement that on our roadsides to the best of our ability. We are one of several DOTs who are participating in the Monarch Highway. This is an initiative that many of you have probably heard of. This is a 35 corridor project, although it's not meant to be 35, the roadside within 35 only. It's that whole larger corridor, not necessarily even roadside habitat in some cases. We are also very involved in research. We help support research through direct funding, as well as sitting on technical panels to help guide research, connect those researchers with transportation practitioners, things of that nature. One bit of context that I want to provide that will be helpful in answering questions later is that MnDOT, as a road manager, only manages the interstates, the U.S. highways, and the state highways. And if you look at the statewide perspective, that's only about 10 to 12% of roadways in Minnesota. The rest of the roadways are actually maintained and managed by counties, townships, and cities. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go forward. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
All right, I'll remind each of you that you have your own mic too. No, I'm just saying. Okay, yeah, sure, it's fine. Okay, no, never mind. Carry on. Okay, anyway, now to you to talk about the Monarch joint venture. We have a highway project of our own, but tell us more about Monarch joint venture.
Sure, yeah, so I work for Monarch Joint Venture. I work with a network of partners, about 80 official partners, and a lot of what we do is share information. So we have the pleasure to work on a species that, goes across the entire continent and flies across 3 countries. So I work with biologists in 3 countries. And something that we've noticed is that there's a lot of amazing information and programming that takes place in all these different localities. But what we can do is try to help share some of that information. So a lot of conservation work happens locally, and so we're able to learn from one another's successes and share that information across boundaries and borders. I'm working on a project where we are assessing habitat at this national scale. We're looking at milkweed and nectar plants and use by monarchs in different habitat types. So agricultural lands, parklands, developed spaces, and rights-of-way, and we're able to compare the usage of those areas nationally, and this is very important for conservation. We're also leading a project with Eric and Chris, which is creating tools for roadside managers, so taking research information and putting it at their fingertips. And we're also created a way that they could rapidly assess the habitat in their roadside rights-of-way and calculate a score based on what they find there as for how it may serve as monarch habitat. And we have a landscape prioritization GIS type model as well. And so we're bringing those resources to transportation managers. So those are just a couple things that I'm working on.
All right, so monarchs, I think, bring up a really challenging species because it crosses, it's a transnational species. It migrates from Mexico all the way up into Minnesota and into Canada a little bit. And so one of the challenges is the coordination of that research across all the states, and that's one of the things we've been working on. So speaking of challenges, I wanted to know, and maybe successes, just to talk about an example challenge that you've particularly faced, like as you've been legislating or managing or researching, either as a challenge or success. I'll leave it up to you just to give some insights. Jean, again, I'll start with you.
Well, the challenge in the Minnesota legislature is the chemical industry. That's just it. And so I'm going to give you an example. A bill that was introduced by my colleague Fu Lee from North Minneapolis, and I put a copy of it up there just to show you how simple this bill is. It said a person may not use a product containing an insecticide in a wildlife management area if the insecticide is from the neonicotinoid class of insecticides. The key here is this is wildlife management areas. That's all land owned. It's our land, and it's used for hunting. And the FU brought it before a committee, and the chemical industry obviously opposed it. And the opposition is always, it will hurt farmers. Well, you know, not putting an insecticide on a wildlife management area is not going to hurt farmers. But that is always the excuse that is given. So FU's bill passed and is on the House floor. However, as we kind of guessed might happen, the Senate Republican author pulled the bill. So now FU's bill does not have a companion, and that's not to say it's dead, but it is to say that's the challenge we made. Tomorrow, there's a bill coming up from Jim Davney of Minneapolis that is essentially saying that cities of the first class, that's Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, can say no neonics in our cities. And that is the refuge, giving a place of refuge. I know what's going to happen to that bill. It's gone to the Ag Committee, and I know what's going to happen. It's not going to get out. So this is the problem we have. I have a simpler bill for next year that I've already put out that, because they're going to say Jim's is too complex, and I'll have a simpler one next year that any city can adopt a very specific piece of ordinance that says no neonics. But that's all, and that's in that city. But things won't change until the public says, hey, wait a minute, this is not right. And I'm going to tell you, I think the public is changing. The new legislators we have now are smart, and they're younger, and they totally get what is going on. You don't have to explain it to them. I suspect the next election will make it a lot easier for pollinators, but I don't know that. It's been very, very difficult up to this time. I'm glad to talk more about how I see this all playing out, and I mean how the chemical industry works in Minnesota, because it's ubiquitous at the legislature.
Thanks a lot for that. Chris, how about you? I'll turn it over to you. Challenges, successes.
Sure. We face many challenges trying to incorporate conservation activities into what we do as a transportation system manager. But one of the challenges we faced more recently with the pollinator discussion, this increased focus on getting pollinator habitat in roadsides, is the potential unintended consequences of impacting future road construction projects. And so when we evaluate a project, we have to go through both state and federal environmental reviews, depending on where that funding is coming from. Some folks within the agency have expressed some concerns about creating habitat in the roadside, knowing that at some point in the future, maybe 15, 20, 25 years down the line, we're going to have to come back and impact that habitat. And so that's been a challenge, but one of the ways we've been successful of changing that discussion is working very closely with Fish and Wildlife Service on what is referred to as a candidate conservation agreement with assurances. And there's this really great public-private partnership right now developing one of these candidate conservation agreements with assurances, abbreviated CCAA, it's a little bit easier to say, for the monarch butterfly. And so through the development of this agreement, we hope to be able to put more habitat in roadsides where it's appropriate to put habitat, and meeting these conservation objectives within this agreement, and in exchange we get some regulatory assurances in the future that we're able to go back into those areas, temporarily disturb those areas to maintain the transportation infrastructure, but in the long term it's going to have a net conservation benefit to the species, and so it's really a win-win, a challenge that we were able to overcome through working with conservation partners.
Yeah, Chris, could you provide a little background on, that the monarch is a candidate for listing, and then what would happen if they didn't enter into the CCAA?
Sure.
What the fear is of that?
Sure. So as I suspect many of you know, the monarch has been petitioned for federal listing under the Endangered Species Act. And if the monarch were to be listed, things like mowing, again, ground disturbance that results in the loss of milkweed when caterpillars may be present would all be considered take under the Endangered Species Act. That's regulated. It creates very lengthy environmental review processes that agencies or private organizations that are having some sort of on-the-ground disturbance have to deal with. And so the concern is, like I mentioned, we'd create all this habitat, we'd attract what would become a very rare species to our roadsides, and it would turn a multi-year planning process into a decade-long planning process. And we've seen that with other species, so it's not just a hypothetical. And so again, we've worked closely with the researchers and with the agencies that are protecting these species to come up with this solution to address this challenge. Was there anything else specifically that you wanted to address?
That was great. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Okay. Allison, let's keep the monarch theme going here. Successes, challenges.
Yeah, so monarchs are challenged, as are all pollinators, I guess, by climatic effects. So I think that's something that is in the realm of things that we're still wondering a bit about. We know that their population fluctuates a lot year to year. You may have heard that they did really well last winter in Mexico. So that was probably because we had fabulous weather for them last spring, last summer, last fall, and favorable winds to get them back to Mexico. So they do have sort of this boom and bust cycling, as do a lot of insects. So, we're trying to find a place for them where they can fluctuate that's high enough so that they don't fluctuate below zero, right? Well, one thing that we've noted is with warmer wintertime temperatures, there are places now in the southern U.S. where they are breeding year-round. And this, in these areas, there's a much higher prevalence of a disease that they get because the disease is not purged out from the system each winter like it is here. There's no disease outside on the milkweed plants. So in those places, people are planting also a non-native milkweed species, a tropical milkweed, and so that tends to stay green all winter, and there's this year-round breeding, and we have this higher incidence of disease. So those are some interesting things that I think that we can keep a watch on through time. Also, how does predation change? How are other parasites changing with changing over the years? So those are some things that we're still interested in. I'd say a positive, I'll just quickly switch to that. It's just been that there's been a huge groundswell of support in providing habitat for monarchs, and this idea that while we can't affect the climate so quickly, we can affect the places that they could breed, and by providing them throughout the landscape. For instance, research shows that a monarch that has more different milkweed patches to choose from will lay more eggs. So we know there are some things that we can do, which is to spread milkweed and nectar plants throughout the landscape, and we've just seen tremendous efforts in this area, and people have been putting those into a big database and providing that to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that monarch conservation database is being taken into consideration in the listing decision. So there's been a lot of really positives, I think, in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's been interesting that the threat of the monarch being listed and the restrictions that would lead to has just brought everybody desperate to not get it, just save it as fast as possible. It's been actually sort of cool. Dan, last but not least, yeah.
Yeah, so to kind of piggyback off what Allison was saying about the groundswell of interest, it's really the case. It's really amazing to come to Minnesota and see this passion for pollinators. It's been really wonderful. One of the things that's been tricky on this is that a lot of people now really want to put in habitat, which is also this really beneficial thing. But we're seeing it can be costly, and there is some pushback on putting in habitat. So, for example, there's a whole big federal program that's been really great for Wildlife Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. And that's been one avenue. There's some different conservation programs within CRP to put in pollinator habitat into those types of mixes. And there's been some pushback from, including politicians here in Minnesota, to not do that because of the high expense of that. So there's, can be sometimes expensive to get the habitat in. So one of the things that we're trying to work on is really, as I mentioned in our earlier project, is how do you best make pollinator habitat really highly effective? So that's, I think, a really important thing given for certain costs. So we have a number of different projects kind of looking at that, which I'm excited to get into. And then the other thing is, I think the public is really ready for this, but also the great variability that we have when we talk about pollinators, like how many species that is. People often ask me, like, how are the bees doing? And there's like 20,000 species, It's like, you don't ask a birder how birds are doing, right? It's really, it's an amazing thing. And so when we talk about installing a lot of these habitats, I think we also have to really think about what are our goals? What are our, how do we optimize for certain things? Are we trying to optimize for, maximize for things? Are there trade-offs in promoting one group of species over another? And I think these are, to me as a scientist, really fascinating and exciting questions, but things that we haven't answered yet that I'm really hoping to shed some light onto, so.
Yeah, and I wonder, before we open it up to the audience, if, speaking of how are the bees, how's the rusty patch bumblebee, and is there any new legislation on that at all?
So for those of you who don't know, the rusty patch bumblebee is it's a fascinating species, and it's a bee that was found basically from here all the way over to New Jersey. It used to be really common, one of the more common bumblebees, and it's really hard actually to detect changes in trends of insects over time, but this species has basically gone from like 98% of its range. It's just a dramatic, quick loss of the species. It's really been incredible. Now, the places that it still is persistent is in, we have populations here in Minnesota, and we have populations in like Madison, and probably populations in between, but there aren't as many university people looking for bees in between. So it's actually persistent here, and we actually have the ability to do something, which is actually really exciting. If you were in New Jersey, you don't have the ability anymore to conserve rusty patch. We do, and this is a federally listed, first bee in the continental United States that's been listed as endangered, federally listed as endangered. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just a little bit of backdrop. I hope there's more legislation, but anyways, if you have anything to say about it, Gene. No? Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
And I think with the remaining time, I'm just going to open up to the audience. Anyone questions about pollinators and people and management, policy, research? Yeah. I don't know who has mics to give them, but I have to.
So, question for Christopher Smith about the rusty patch bumblebee. You said if the monarch is listed, it's going to be decades of work. What's been going on with MnDOT and the federal listing of the rusty patch?
Yep, so one of the things we did right at the beginning when we started hearing about this rusty patch bumblebee, it wasn't really on our radar, is we wanted to better assess, is this bumblebee using roadside habitats? And so we generated some funding, we put out a request for proposals, and actually Dr. Caravo's lab received the funding to do this work. Since we've learned a lot from that research, it's not quite wrapped all the way up, but we've also worked closely with Fish and Wildlife now post-listing to better understand how the species utilizes roadsides. In general, our perception is that they are certainly foraging in roadsides. We see workers, especially in roadsides. We don't have any evidence of them making their nest in roadsides. One of the things we have started to do differently is to use more native seed mixes on our projects when we're in an area that Fish and Wildlife has identified as having a high potential for rusty patch bumblebees. But there's still a lot to learn, like Dr. Caravo mentioned. There's a lot unknown about populations of these bees, and while rusty patch are probably a little better off than many, we still don't quite know the importance of roadsides for that species, at least as far as I'm aware. Dan, do you want to add anything else?
This question is also for Chris. I'm kind of curious, like I'm not advocating against doing more, but I'm curious, there's a kind of a known issue of if we're putting pollinator-friendly habitat near farms where they're spraying pesticides, insecticides, like you are potentially creating a trap or species that you're trying to help. And I'm wondering to what extent is that being assessed and understood. Like I assume there's a lot of wind turbulence that may, it's great to save the butterflies, but if how many more end up on windshields, sort of thing.
Yeah, great question. And I think, and I'll probably turn it over to Allison here, but I think some of the research that's ongoing is trying to better assess that exact question. I think when you look at insect biology, the biology varies immensely across all the different insects, and there may be some insects that are more tolerant to residing in those areas and species that are less tolerant to that, but that research is ongoing, and I don't know, Allison, if you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. Some of the work that Eric mentioned, Emily Snell-Rude is a professor here, and she's working on the project with the chemicals coming off the roadways. It looks like preliminary information suggests that, the effects are most acute closest to the road, and that is also the area that is mowed most frequently. So that does ameliorate those effects a bit. And it's that back slope of the roadside areas that I think has the most value for habitat. And there's been a lot of efforts to reduce the mowing frequencies of those, not just here, but in other states as well. The idea about whether, how frequently drift is affecting the reproduction of monarchs, for instance, is something that's very much still out there and not very well resolved. So it's a tricky problem to study in the field to determine how frequently the winds are such that on the day that was sprayed that there are effects. So I think the jury's still out a bit on that. We do know that there's some information that monarchs, and you may have seen some publications about this, that when they funnel during migration and there are very, very high numbers of monarchs crossing, particularly in South Texas and also in northern Mexico, there's some mountain passes that they do go over. There can be some significant traffic mortality. Now, where they're out and about in the landscape, some other research suggests that monarchs will move alongside of a road and use it as sort of a corridor into other suitable areas, and they're less likely, when they have good habitat along the edge, to cross over. So, it's, I guess, something still that's very active in research.
Hi there. So I'm thinking of some practical things that I could do maybe and wondering now. So I restored a 15-acre savanna that used to be prairie, judging from the stuff that was around the edge, but then was agriculture. And so I restored it back to prairie. It had, when it was brome and so on, it had milkweeds. Now that the bluestem has grown up, there's no milkweeds. And I don't know if that was because of the process to get it to prairie or if the big bluestem crowds out milkweeds. So should I try to plant some milkweeds back? That's what I feel like doing now after this talk. And then what other forbs it was very forb rich at first and now it's more grass rich. But what other forbs should I do for like the endangered bees and clearly for monarchs I should try to get those milkweeds back.
Yeah, I'd say if you could create some bare ground, they really like that disturbance. And there's often seeds available in the environment.
The milkweeds like
yeah.
that, you mean?
So if you tried opening up a little bit of ground, see what happens with that.
And I could actively plant milkweeds, right?
You could put plugs
in.
Favorite blooming plants? Do you know yet?
Still working on that. But I think, are you but that's one of the big things.
I
is
did
that,
burn at first, but not for the last few years. But
Yeah, so the burning will definitely keep the forbs going a bit. I don't know how milkweeds do with fire, but we're actually doing some research on burning right now and which plants kind of do well with that. But that's one of the things we found in some of these restored prairies is blooming plants, or as a fire.
I don't want to get too far out of my lane, but I think Laetris might be helpful for monarch nectar. Is that right?
I did plant 25 million Laetris seeds, and about 50 of them came up.
You should get some horticulture training then or something.
There is a good website that our state agencies need to follow, and it's also available for the public on pollinator habitat and what should be planted. And I hear good things about it. I have not followed it, but I do hear good things about it from the Board of Soil and Water Resources.
Someone in the sun.
Could do to be a better citizen, what would you most like to see each one of us do when we leave here?
For me?
Yeah, you start.
Well, I do have a bit of an entomology background, and I think one of the things we can all do is, at least if you own the land where you live, is to plant some pollinator habitat in your yard. It's relatively easy to do. There's a whole variety of plants now that are available on the market, and the rusty patch bumblebee, for instance, is one that can actually show up in your front yard, and so you can have an endangered species residing in your yard, and that's a relatively easy first step, and from there, the sky is the limit.
I have native plants in my front yard, but I, of course, coming from the legislature, would say you really need to talk to your legislator and let them know that this is a priority for you, both your House member and your Senate member, and it would not hurt to drop an email to the governor.
So I second both what Chris and Jean said. The other thing that's, for those of you so inclined, there's a lot of fantastic citizen science programs out there. The one I'll mention from the bee perspective, we have one called Bumblebee Watch, and that's how we know, in a sense, that we have a, still worrisome, but we have rusty patch here. We're actually using those data. Our lab is using those data to do some really good research. So that's a really great way to get in. You just need a cell phone and the Bumblebee Watch app, and there's lots of citizen science apps. But it really helps people kind of get involved in, I think, looking at these insects. One of the wonderful things about pollinators is that they're really easy to observe. You just go to flowers and you can watch them and really observe amazing behavior. So they're fantastic to work with in that sort of sense, and a great way for people to kind of become citizen scientists, I think, is another way.
Yeah, that's a great point. That large-scale monitoring project that we run is fueled mostly by volunteers, so we definitely really value citizen scientists and Monarch Realm as well. If you're interested, come find me afterwards. And it's all about native habitat, so you can be an advocate in your community with your city, your parks department. You can explain why it looks so messy over there, why they don't mow it anymore. Things like that can be really helpful too.
Hi, great work, all of you, and good information. I was just at a best practices pollinator workshop last week, and one thing I didn't know about after talking with the Arrest the Pest folks was a milkweed that is in southern Minnesota now, and it could or will be probably moving up here, and she called it strangle something, and it's toxic to the caterpillars, and we should strangleweed. And I'm wondering, I wouldn't have known about it had I not gone to her booth and talked to her. What are we doing to make sure we're all on the lookout for things like that and invasives like that we should be getting rid of and out of there? I mean, we know about buckthorn, we know about garlic mustard, but this was new to me.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. I think invasive species is something that hasn't come up a lot today, but it's certainly something that Chris in the roadside realm deals with. And I encounter this a lot when I talk with rights-of-way managers, is that something that they're always combating, and it's an important consideration to try to create space for native plants. And the recognition of this particular plant is something that we need to do better with information sharing, certainly.
Yeah, so for better or worse, a lot of our invasive species tend to come in along the roadsides. And so one of the things that we do is we train a lot of our mowing operators and staff that are out in the field to be early detectors. And we work closely with Department of Ag and others, and DNR and others on this issue. And so we do try to get ahead of these things. So, you know, anytime a new species kind of makes the list, we make sure our folks are trained in. We do a lot of detecting of new species into the state, and we are, at least for those species that are identified by Department of Ag as eradicate species, we do make every effort to try to eradicate those species before they spread further within the state.
I can bring up another subject.
One of the things that you all might be interested in when I talked about wildlife management areas that you own, and there's no good number on this, but well over 70,000 acres, probably close to 200,000 acres of wildlife management area. And the attitude about wildlife management areas is changing. It used to be grass was just fine, and now people are saying, oh, no, we've got to have more forbs. So there are insects for the pheasant hunters. And now we're hearing about pollinators and folks saying, no, we've got to have more forbs for pollinators. Well, there's a third thing coming up in a bill that will be heard tomorrow. This would be great land for carbon sink. And because I chair the committee now on climate change, or energy and climate, we are going to be looking at planting natives in wildlife management area. And this notion that it's too expensive, it was interesting to hear, because we have money set aside in the legacy fund, and it's over $100 million a year. Republicans don't want to buy more land. So what's the alternative? You can restore. And so I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity for restoration, for prairie, because now it's a three-fer. It's for the hunters, it's for the pollinators, and it's for the carbon sink.
So, Eric, I'm holding the microphone, and I will take that opportunity to ask a question. And so the title of the session is Pollinators and People. So if we were to turn to the human side, and I've heard good things about education, I've heard good things about individual actions, but if you think about things that people can do together, which is obviously what makes change, what do you guys see as the most promising sort of interventions to make that are on that collective action? How do we aggregate power to make change?
Let's go back to how we use all this wildlife management area that we own, and does it work for all of us? Work for the hunters, work for the people who want to do birding, and work as a carbon sink. So there is a collective thing we could do there that we haven't done before. It's just been hunting land. So maybe there's more opportunity because we all do own it.
I did an interesting exercise last summer. I went out and surveyed for habitat within the urban landscape, and I found that very interesting. I think there are opportunities where we live and work and down the street and along the trail and whatnot. And there's a lot of really great efforts that I think we can continue to support in tiny spaces and along the edges of farm fields and such.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit of work that I've been learning about with trying to get values alignment sort of integrated. So if it's not just for pollinators, what are some other things we could do? So in our last second Monday, we heard about integrating pollinator habitat into solar, right, into solar arrays, so that you're also providing for and looking for opportunities there. Also, there's been renewed or new interest in creating milkweed farms. The filaments or the hairs inside the milkweed are actually more insulating or have better insulation than down. And so you could actually create coats with milkweed. So actually create a milkweed farm. So the farm itself would have value economically, and then it would be a massive monarch stopover area too. So there are, and I think also because the filaments are hollow, they're actually good for molecular work with chemicals of some kind. That's not my expertise. But anyway, I think there are opportunities for alignment sort of economically as well. That's a great question, though.
I have a question for Senator Wagenius. It's great to talk to your legislators, but it seems like the legislature needs structural change if anything is going to happen, in any reasonable timeline. You mentioned two examples, wildlife management areas, and then the first order cities. And you said once it goes to the Ag Committee, it's dead, or if it goes to the Senate, it's dead. Why does something that let the big cities regulate or decide what kind of pesticides, insecticides can be used within their city boundaries? Why does that have to go to the Ag Committee? You need to get it out of the Ag Committee. I don't know how to do it. But if you're just going to be left with voluntary measures. So often this happens. I worked in state government for 27 years. Unless you have the authority and the will to regulate, and that's the most efficient way to do things oftentimes, you're just going to be asking people to do, please do this, please do that. Get stuff out of the Ag Committee, or else get good people in it. You can comment.
Legislators are the way we are because of you all. It's the voters who choose what we do and what we don't do. And our legislature is changing because so many people live in our suburbs right now. In fact, when I came to the legislature, there was a coalition between urban and rural, and that was the biggest block of people. But now urban isn't that big, rural isn't that big, suburban is. Suburban's huge. And with the next redistricting, it's going to be even bigger. And so there's going to be a whole attitude change at the legislature because of voters. I mean, we answer to voters. But there is a change coming because the population is changing.
So I think a lot of us would be interested in some specific ways we could affect change at the committee level. So if someone were to start just an email chain, I mean, it could go to student groups, garden clubs, could spread out, and then you could get more people to show up at these committee meetings and drown out the chemical companies. So are you doing that? Are you notifying your constituents when these committee meetings are?
We call that at the legislature the inside game. And what goes on just in the legislature, I think it's what happens outside. It is so much more important. It is folks talking to their own legislators. And I'll go back to a story when I was, before I was in the legislature. I worked with a group of women who wanted to do an order for protection for battered women. And it was stuck in the legislature in a Senate committee and wouldn't get out. And so we called women in outstate Minnesota, and I can remember we called somebody in Worthington, and they got women sat down with their legislator and said, you've got to do something. And that happened about 3 or 4 communities where the legislator was talked to about women in their, about battered women in their own communities with coffee at home. And that changed everything. The chair could not sit on the bill anymore, and that's the year the order for protection passed. It came from folks talking to their legislators at home.
Hello. I want to talk about honeybees. I thought that there was a select committee that the governor had called, and they didn't even mention systemic seed treatment of neonicotinoids or whatever. I thought I heard that on NPR, so maybe let me know if I heard right. I mean, if you have millions of acres of agronomic crops, corn and soybeans, where they use treatment throughout the whole plant, you know, and it's like over millions of acres this is occurring. I mean, and that's the crux right there. Maybe you guys want to talk about that. And lastly, see, I have a bee man who comes to my farm. I grow vegetables, or I grow corn and soybeans, or whatever. And last year, his whole yard died. A yard is like 30 beehives. And we used to go 6 high, and now we're lucky to go 2 or 3 high. I mean, the bee situation is terrible, and it's like, I need the bees to pollinate my squash. Well, they're not there anymore. Plus, I don't get my 12 quarts of honey either, which I'm addicted to. So maybe discuss what I've just been talking about here. Thank you.
Oh, that's not me.
I'm not sure about there was a governor's panel on pollinators that I'm not sure. I can't speak to that because I haven't seen that yet.
Well, they didn't do anything.
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about is a stakeholder group. And stakeholder groups at the legislature are designed for procrastination. They started in about, I'm going to say about the mid-90s, and it was started by the chemical industry. When they didn't want something to happen, they would get together a stakeholder group. And I'm going to back off and say, the observations here that I'm making are about things in the environmental area. Maybe stakeholder groups work in some other areas. But in the environmental area, folks will say, and this was the pollinator group that met with the governor for 2 years, or met under the governor's auspices for 2 years. They talked and they talked and they talked, but the chemical industry had a veto. And so not much happened. I haven't seen any legislation come from that stakeholder group. But I always feel that if somebody's resorting to a stakeholder group, it's resorting to procrastination.
So I think we're out of time now with that, and that was not a great way to end, but it's so lots of things to do. I just want to first point out that, you know, sustainable land use, I think we exposed a lot of the trade-offs and challenges. It's complicated. We only talked really mainly about pollinators, but there are other issues in our land and land management obviously to talk about. So we'll continue to be working on that. And before we end, please thank again our panelists for coming. This was a great conversation, and thank you for all participating. And feel free to mingle and ask other questions, and we'll talk more for the next few minutes. Thanks a lot.